Hello, good morning. My name is Cupin. You are watching Rappler, and I am in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, to cover the 40th and the 41st ASEAN Summits here in Cambodia. Kaka-open nilang actually formally yung opening ng summit kanina. Just a few hours ago, a few minutes ago rather, it opened at the Sokha Hotel in Phnom Penh. Although opening pa lang siya ng ASEAN, yung activities related to the summits featuring or involving the heads of state and heads of government actually started yesterday. But before we go ahead and talk about ASEAN, I want to show you where I am because we're in Phnom Penh again. Wala pa kami sa mismong ASEAN Media Center because we wanted to monitor the opening. But I'll show you where I am. Oh, it's hard to see where I am. So this is there. That's beautiful Phnom Penh. The river near me. I'll give you the pronunciation later. But we're actually sandwiched between two rivers. You can see there. I don't know if you can see it there. So a lot of the city has actually shut down. Or kumbaga, some schools have closed. Or some parts of the roads are closed. Whenever world leaders pass by, as you can understand, you have currently merong heads of delegation. Hindi lahat ng president at prime minister andito. Basta yung mga heads of government tsaka heads of state ng iba't ibang miyembro ng ASEAN ay andito. Andito rin syempre yung heads of state and heads of government of ASEAN allies. So mamaya we'll walk you through the different groupings of ASEAN. So kung nagtataka ka kung bakit, let me fix this. So dito muna tayo indoors para hindi masyado nakakasilaw yung view natin. While I walk you through what's happening here in Phnom Penh during the ASEAN Summit. So, like I said, technically the summit formally opened just this morning, a few minutes ago, sorry. But yesterday, several activities na involving the ASEAN leaders, of course, representing the Philippines here is President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. He arrived in Phnom Penh on November 9. So technically, this would be his second full day in Cambodia. He flew in along with the Philippine delegation, including the media delegation. So if you saw earlier, there was footage of the media, us covering him, interviewing him on PR001. That's another story altogether. And might talk about the experience of riding PR001 in a different broadcast. So this is the first regional summit that President Marcos will be participating in. This is his fourth kumbaga, pre-announced at work official work travel. Yung unang dalawa rather na work travels abroad as the head of state was for state visits, first to Indonesia and then to Singapore. And then in September, he flew to New York for the ONGA and working visit. He had several meetings there and he had two bilaterals with the US and Japan. And then he controversially went to Singapore to attend the Grand Prix. And of course, ito na ngayon, the ASEAN Summit. It's his first ASEAN Summit as head of state and the first ASEAN Summit na in-person since the pandemic started. Yung ASEAN Summit last year was only online because travel restrictions were at their height pa. And it wasn't, and borders are mostly closed. But now it's a different scenario. Most borders are closed. In fact, in Cambodia din, if you're talking about restrictions connected to COVID-19, people still wear masks many times, but especially in the ASEAN, in the context of the ASEAN, you'll see people in the media center wearing masks, but everywhere else in Phnom Penh, you're allowed not to wear a mask anymore. So yung full title ng event here in Phnom Penh is 40th and 41st ASEAN Summits and other related summits. So bakit ganun? Maraming summit na nangyayari sa ASEAN. So ngayon, nag-opening na yung ASEAN Summits for like yung main summit with the leaders of ASEAN. Pero maraming summit ang sunod-sunod na mangyayari today alone. Let me walk you through the summits that we expect to happen today. Let me double check the schedules that what is that sound? I don't know if you can hear that, but we'll work through that. So today, for instance, you have You have the 25th ASEAN and China Summit. You have the 23rd ASEAN and Korea Summit. And then you have the ASEAN and the UN Summit. In succeeding days, you'll have the ASEAN plus 3. ASEAN plus 3 is South Korea, Japan, and China, plus the 10 ASEAN member states. And then you have the 19th ASEAN and India Summit, followed by the ASEAN Australia Summit, and then the ASEAN Japan Summit, the ASEAN US Summit, the ASEAN Canada Commemorative Summit, and then you have a gala dinner hosted by the chairman of the ASEAN, of course, the Cambodian Prime Minister. And then on the last day, November 13, you'll have the second ASEAN Global Dialogue, the 17th East Asia Summit. That's a bigger summit, parang different countries in the Asian region, including those outside of Asia, of Southeast Asia rather. And then finally, the closing ceremony. During our interview with the President Marcos, of course, I'm talking about the Philippine President, he mentioned that on top of the summits here in ASEAN, yung nilook forward niya rin yung mga bilateral meetings. Although that schedule is quite tight, typically heads of state and heads of government will absolutely find the time to hold bilateral meetings with their counterparts from different countries. Ano yung bilateral meeting? Bilateral sa dalawang sides. So you have two countries, dapat parang counterparts of the two countries. So when you're talking about one head of state talking to another head of state, pwede rin head of government yung kausap niya. For example, in some countries, like in Cambodia, for instance, the prime minister is the head of government, but it's the king who is the head of state. So kung mag-bilateral ka, typically, like last night, President Marcos had a bilateral with the Prime Minister of Cambodia. So that's what happens during the bilateral meetings. Briefly, in case you're not familiar with what a bilateral is, a bilateral meeting, typically predetermined yung discussion on. May agenda set forth na yung both countries. It depends on the level of the kind of relationship that the two leaders already have. Like for instance, in the case of President Marcos, sabi niya in the case of Canada's Justin Trudeau, they haven't met ever yet. Kahit informally, they haven't met yet. So he expects a bilateral between them to be introductory. So parang getting to know each other. But in contrast naman, when you're talking about Francis Macron, they've met informally at least 2 times, if I recall. That's what he said. That's what he told media. So it'll be more, parang mas clear na yung agenda because he also knows that he knows what France is pushing for in terms of global diplomacy. So yun, I will talk about the other bilaterals quickly, but let's talk about yesterday. So yesterday, yung pinakaunang event dito ni President Marcos was a meeting with Cambodian business leaders. So CEOs, chairmans of different international companies or even regional or Cambodia-based companies that are based here in Cambodia and Phnom Penh. It was a rather early meeting, 7 a.m. here Cambodia time, 8 a.m. in the Philippines. We are one hour behind here in Cambodia. So during the meeting, and we have a report out about that, I worked with Ralph Rivas, my colleague who reports on business in the Philippines, on that, what happened during that meeting with business leaders. Because notably, the Office of the Press Secretary announced in a tweet na President Marcos announced to the Cambodia-based businessmen the GDP growth rate of the Philippines for the third quarter, 7.6. She actually did that, or the OPS announced that before the PSA formally announced the GDP rate for the third quarter. Also, President Marcos earlier, we also have a report about that, reacted on the, on the GDP growth rate nga. Sabi, syempre, matutuwa siya because it did buck expectations of analysts, but he also emphasized, and he acknowledged that inflation is still quite bad in the Philippines, among the highest rates in the region. So that would obviously be a bigger concern because yung problema mo doon ay hindi nararamdaman kahit nag-ease yung ibang indicators pa sa economy, hindi siya nararamdaman ng ordinaryong Pilipino. So President Marcos, in a taped interview, we weren't able to actually ginagamit ko na yung ASEAN terms. We weren't actually able to talk to him yesterday, but the OPS did send a video of him answering a question specifically about the GDP growth rate for the third quarter. So anyway, yesterday, so after that, nagsunod-sunod na yung mga events ng ASEAN mismo. For instance, there were 3 interfaces. Kumbaga, interface, what happens is essentially a dialogue of the ASEAN leaders. So yesterday, there was a dialogue or an interface with the ASEAN Interparliamentary members. So you have members of the different legislative bodies of the different ASEAN countries, and then an interface with the ASEAN youth. Doon nagsalita the youngest governor in the Philippines, Pax Monodat of Sultan Kudarat, and then finally yung Business Advisory Council of the ASEAN interface with the ASEAN leaders. Again, today yung start ng summit. So ito na, sunod-sunod na yan. The summits we'll see if they air them or kahit parts of it is aired just to show who's part of the summit. But we do have a story on what you need to know about Marcos's first ASEAN summit. I laid out there the different groupings. There are a lot of them at sayang naman kung we'll spend most of this conversation talking about the groupings. Also, if you have questions, by the way, about this coverage about the ASEAN, because I also learned a lot about the ASEAN in preparing for this coverage. So let's talk quickly na lang about what ASEAN leaders are likely to talk about or the top of mind issues for ASEAN leaders. Of course, yung una at binanggit din to ni Cambodian Prime Minister, who's also chairman of the ASEAN, yung term niya ay post-COVID, a post-COVID world. That term might be exciting for some people and nerve-wracking for others, because others will argue that it's dangerous to think to have a post-COVID mindset because the virus is still out there, the pandemic is still in place, although many people have been vaccinated. Na that's a tangent. But anyway, so yun, yung parang yung economic development ng mga Southeast Asian countries after restrictions connected to COVID-19 have been eased. Again, one of the reasons also that the Philippines cited, in deciding to lift yung mask mandate natin indoors and outdoors. Although you will notice that a lot of Filipinos still wear masks both indoors and outdoors, is that we need to be at par, quote unquote, with our neighbors in Southeast Asia. It's a different topic altogether. I suggest you watch or you read the reports by Bonds Magsambol about that, kung ano naman yung take ng mga health experts based in Manila or in the Philippines sa concept na yan na kailangan natin lumevel sa ating Southeast Asian neighbor. So yun, let me walk you through quickly. So you have, again, yung parang post-COVID world, specifically talking about the economic status of different ASEAN countries, but also there's also discussions on how do we prevent a pandemic of this scale happening again. There's general acknowledgement na this won't be at the rate we're going, globalization, etc. This is likely to not be the last time na a disease threatens the world. So how do we mitigate the risks or the economic crisis that it triggers should another disease spread all throughout the world and force economies to shut down or world leaders to basically tell their citizens to stay at home and things like that. Okay, so yun, COVID-19. And then, of course, yung mga regional concerns. Top of mind, Myanmar, obviously. Myanmar's de facto head of state, head of government, the junta, they're not here kasi Cambodia said you're not allowed to join the ASEAN summits because they did not comply with an earlier agreement, a 5-point consensus yung term nun. This was issued by then in 2021 on the situation in Myanmar. So yung sinasabi nila, parang basically the 5-point consensus in a gist is a peace consensus na parang the junta will stop any violence happening in Myanmar and respect human rights. Ang sinasabi ng ASEAN, they're not complying, so they're not invited. They weren't formally invited to join the ASEAN Summit. So ang pinadala dito, pumayag si Chairman Cambodia na Myanmar can have a representative, but a non-political representative is representing the interests of Myanmar here in the ASEAN. Also, of course, outside the region ito, pero it definitely affects the region. You have North Korea and Ukraine. Syempre, we all know what's happening in Ukraine. Attempts of Russia to Russia's attack on Ukraine. Wala dito si Russian President Vladimir Putin. Instead, kasi he is not ASEAN, but he is, as Russia is part of the East Asia Summit, he won't be representing Russia here. Instead, according to the Khmer Times, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will be representing Russia at the EAS and all other related summits. Reportedly, according to the Jakarta Post, Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky has requested to join or to call in via video link, although we have yet to see if that's going to push through. But also yesterday, on top of the interfaces of the different ASEAN leaders, Ukraine acceded to or signed hindi pa sila part ng treaty, but we acceded to, kumbaga yun yung step 1 to signing the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. It's a very long treaty with 3 amendments, if I'm not mistaken. It's a peace treaty in essence na are respecting the sovereignty of different states, not just in ASEAN, but also yung signatories to the treaty. There are 49 signatories. Once the process is completed, Ukraine will be the 50th signatory to the TAC, or the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. In many words, this will trigger, or this will formalize Ukraine's interaction with the ASEAN bloc. So currently kasi wala pang involvement si Ukraine formally sa ASEAN. Syempre with individual countries meron, pero ASEAN as a regional bloc, Ukraine wants to have formal relations with that. And then also just a week prior, actually, a North Korean ballistic missile landed less than 60 kilometers off South Korea's coast. It triggered air warnings. That will also be a point of discussion here in Cambodia, most likely. Also, reportedly, according to Japanese media, the US, the Korea, and Japan, the leaders of those countries, are expected to speak on the sidelines of either ASEAN or the G20 in Bali. Hindi tayo kasama sa G20 to talk about North Korea and the threat that it poses. Supposedly kasi North Korea's rationalization of the launch of that missile was because of military exercises between the US and South Korea. But according to analysts, that reasoning doesn't fly kasi pre-scheduled naman talaga. And hindi siya provocation, according to analysts, because kumbaga para siyang regular thing that happens talaga, training and cooperation between the US and South Korea post-COVID. And of course, China. China is obviously not part of Southeast Asia. It's not part of ASEAN, but it is a major ASEAN partner. Again, di ba may ASEAN-China Summit. China is also part of the East Asia Summit. So maraming dealings and involvement si China dito. Wala dito si Chinese President Xi Jinping. Instead, they sent here the Premier of China to represent the country at ASEAN. Yung major thing that frankly is unlikely to be resolved here in Phnom Penh, yung Code of Conduct on the South China Sea. 20 years ago, here in Phnom Penh, actually in 2002, ASEAN, so meaning the bloc, all 10 countries of ASEAN and China, signed what is called the Declaration. Let me double check. The Declaration of the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, or the DOS. In essence, yung declaration na yon, nag-agree sila na kailangan natin mag-agree on a code of conduct. 20 years later, hindi pa sila nag-agree. And why is this? Of course, the 10 countries of ASEAN and China have different stands, different takes on how to handle conflicts in the South China Sea. So if you're talking about the South China Sea in the Philippine world, recently we call it the West Philippine Sea. Of the 10 member states in ASEAN, 4 have disputes with China. Of course, the Philippines, you have Brunei, you have Malaysia, and Vietnam. So yung different countries na yon might have different takes, although the Philippines' position is, of course, we do need a COC. Actually, in general, all of the ASEAN countries and China agree that we do need a COC. Kaya nga sila nag-sign ng DOS, ang declaration that we need a COC. Ang problema ngayon, ano bang laman ng COC na yun? Kasi consensus is needed of all parties. Hindi pwedeng magka-COC if kahit one country that opposes let's say, a draft, if they say no to it, it won't fly. It has to be consensus ng lahat. So parang strength and downfall, yun, a lot of analysts will tell you that's the downfall of ASEAN, because nga it's really based on consensus, and you have these different states and different governments with different agendas and different takes on these big issues. It's difficult and nearly impossible to reach that consensus. Ayun din pala yung difference. Yung DOS, yung declaration, non-binding siya. Yung COC will be binding. So, mas malaki din ang say. So, it's also understandable kung bakit mainit yung discussion at bakit it's harder to get a consensus between the ASEAN bloc and China. Recap lang din, nag-ring yung doorbell. Hindi ko alam bakit tinatawag na kami para pumunta ng International Media Center. Quickly though, the rest of this trip, President Marcos, other things that the ASEAN leaders will likely also discuss. Of course, you have Ukraine, you have North Korea, you have other security issues. Timor-Leste's appeal to be part of ASEAN, hindi pa sinasagot. It's a years-old application na. We'll see if ASEAN acts on that. And that's it for now. After the ASEAN Summit officially closes on the 13th, President Marcos will be flying back to the Philippines. But before he does that, he will have an event with the Filipino community here in Cambodia. Typically nga kasi actually, yung Filipino community event, that's what starts his visit to a foreign country. But in this case, because the schedule is quite tight, we arrived in Phnom Penh 9th. What day is the 9th? Wednesday ng gabi. So wala ka ng time to meet the Filipino community. And also on the 9th, Independence Day yun ng Cambodia. So a lot of the shops, a lot of the streets were closed because of the celebrations connected to that. And yun nga, because there's an ASEAN Summit. If you recall, if you're old, young enough to remember when Manila or the Philippines hosted summits like the APEC or ASEAN, talagang many parts of the metro are shut down temporarily or partially, partly to ensure the security of world leaders visiting for the summit. So, yun nga. So we'll cap. I might go live again later today or maybe tomorrow just to talk about PR001, the ASEAN here, other side things that are happening. And then after Cambodia, we will be flying to Bangkok, Thailand naman for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, APEC. World leaders will be moving there naman. So, medyo maraming summits nangyayari sa Southeast Asia ngayon. Cambodia, Thailand, and you have G20, which we are not part of, happening in Bali. So that's why in some of the summits, it's not the head of state or it's not the president who's representing the country. Like, for example, I believe in APEC, it will be Vice President Kamala Harris of the US will be representing the United States, because President Biden will be going to the G20 to participate there. And Kamala Harris will be visiting the Philippines after the APEC summit. That's it for me for now here in Phnom Penh. Tinatawag na ata kami because we need to go to the Soka Hotel, but that's the International Media Center, where media from all over the region and the world really are covering the ASEAN Summits. If you have any questions, you can just comment them here. You can tweet me at Cupin, and you can email me if you want that. Thank you for watching. Check Rappler.com for stories related to the ASEAN Summits. Thank you. Bye.